It's a special day today, not only because we're going to hear from Richard Reeves, who's one of America's great presidential biographers and has thought a great deal about presidential leadership, which is what we will be discussing in a few minutes, but also because somebody who was a dear friend to USC and to those of us at the Annenberg School died yesterday, Norman Corwin. And you can see him right here in this marvelous bust of Norman. And he died at the age of 101. And so I guess we shouldn't be sad when somebody dies, but oddly, in Norman Corwin's case, it seemed young. Not just because he was the sort of person we thought would live forever, but because his father died at 110, and his brother died last year at 106. So Norman seemed like he was just starting to get moving.
The kid?
A kid. I want to tell a story about Norman, and then I'm going to ask Richard to talk about him a little bit, and then Jeff Baum is going to play a special tribute to Norman. But I want to tell a story that I think brings presidential politics into this. First of all, in 1940, Norman Corwin produced the first ever election eve political broadcast. It was for Franklin Roosevelt, 1940. The MC of that political broadcast was Humphrey Bogart. Producer was Norman Corwin. And he told the story and could tell it at length, but one of the things that always fascinated me, and you'll see we'll come back to this in a moment, was that one of the people in his entourage that night for that show was a man who talked about the fact that he had cast his first vote in 1861 for Abraham Lincoln. So in a way, through Norman Corwin, you could touch back to somebody who had voted for Abraham Lincoln. Well, I tell this story because in 2008, a play that Norman Corwin had written in 1958 was revived, and it's called The Rivals. The Rivals features really two actors. One is Abraham Lincoln, played by David Strathorn in the play that I'm describing, and the other Stephen Douglas, played by Paul Giamatti in this revival of The Rivals. Originally, the play was performed in 1958, and because I moderated a panel with Norman afterward, I did a little bit of research to see how it had been reviewed in 1958. Well, 1958, when it first came out, it was the 100th anniversary of the actual Lincoln-Douglas debates, which, of course, had started the whole notion of debates. And Brooks Atkinson, who was the great reviewer for the New York Times, in his review said, "Isn't it amazing, here we are in 1958, to see how far things have come in terms of race relations." That was 1958. That was when blacks still couldn't vote in the South. That's before the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 65. But that was the play in 1958. So now there was this revival 50 years later in 2008, and it was in late October, and marvelous cast and great conversation afterward. And I read this quote from Brooks Atkinson, and Norman Corwin then said that he was proud to say that he had cast an absentee ballot already that day for the man he hoped would be President of the United States, and it was Barack Obama, who was elected as the first black president, something one could never have dreamed of back when that man who Norman Corwin in 1940 had helped to produce a show with had voted for Abraham Lincoln. So what an amazing life Norman Corwin lived, and we were tremendously privileged to have him among us. Richard Reeves, do you want to share a memory or two about Norman Corwin?
Well, I always thought we had in class the other day a conversation about why we watched The War of the Worlds, the Orson Welles adaptation of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and the students asked, why did people talk the way they did on that show? Very plummy, more complicated multisyllabic words and whatnot. And the answer was they wrote that way, they spoke that way because of Norman Corwin.
Wow.
Norman Corwin, who really combined, many of them had been Broadway actors, so they had, like Orson Welles. But in the 20th century, there were three styles of speech that those of us who can remember the middle to late parts of it, where the American people spoke like people who, the influence they had. One was Franklin Roosevelt, one was Norman Corwin, and the third was Walter Cronkite. They literally, these people, individuals, determined the way Americans spoke, as some famous people had done for England, so that it was just extraordinary how the stretch of the man from, I didn't know the 1861 story, but we were all lucky to have known him. There was a nice scene at graduation last year when we were lined up by schools, and for reasons I don't fully understand, Annenberg was the last school. We were lined up in that field over there before we were called, and 10 minutes maybe before the time came to march to the graduation, Norman Corwin came along in a wheelchair with his caretaker, and all the Annenberg people stood there and applauded. It was really a moving moment, and you did have a sense that perhaps this would be his last graduation. Norman was asked to write his own obituary, and he resisted for a long time. He came, as Jeff said, from a very long-lived family. But finally he agreed for, I've forgotten which magazine, to write his own autobiography, his own obituary. And it began, Norman Corwin, a famous radio writer, died last night at the age of 26, shot by a jealous husband.
106. 106, shot by a jealous husband. But he was one of the giants of our world, and he was at both ends of a world that changed when it went from print to radio on to television. He inspired so many people, and you're about to hear his own words, but I think some of you will still remember the name Carl Sandburg, one of the great poets of the last century. And Carl Sandburg described Norman Corwin as one of the great poets of the last century. And Jeff Baum will help us hear some of those words.
Sure, I just wanted to also share for the students who are here who might not have known him. He was in the classroom until about 3 years ago teaching Annenberg journalism students, and was still passionate and excited and curious about their lives. And he was a very kind man that gave so much of himself, even into his late 90s and when he was 100. He invited me to join him for dinner one night with Walter Cronkite. There was just four of us, Walter Cronkite and his assistant, and Norman and myself. And it's that type of generous spirit that he wanted to bring everybody along, and saw his role as a mentor. And so what Richard was describing, that I wanted to share a piece of his work with you. And if anybody has a chance to see it, I don't know if you recall, there was a documentary film about Norman Corwin that won the Academy Award for a short subject documentary about 3 years ago, and it shows him in the classroom with students at USC. And it was a very inspiring film that gives you a sense of the figure that he is. The piece that I'm about to play is part of one of his most famous works. It's called On a Note of Triumph. And just to set the stage, it was aired on the night that the United States and the Allied forces prevailed over Nazi Germany and Europe. And the context was after 4 years of one of the most devastating wars in our nation's history, and of course the world history. There was this catharsis that came. And I'm going to just play a 5-minute segment. It has the language that Richard was describing, a different style of language that we're used to having today. But you'll get a sense of the poetry and why he was known as the poet laureate of radio. And I'm going to play the 5-minute segment called What Have We Learned? And then it will lead us into what have we learned then, and then how does that apply to the political situation that we have in the nation today. I think it's very appropriate and will help set the stage for our conversation with Richard about presidential politics.
Again, we return you to the Conqueror, man of the textbooks of millenniums ahead.
But what have we known now that we didn't know before? What have we learned out of this war?
What have we learned? For one thing, evil is not always as insidious as advertised, but will upon occasion give fair warning, just as smoke announces the intention of flame to follow. Never has disaster had so many heralds as this war. Cassandra spoke from every lecture platform, and the notices were posted high and low. A cabinet minister resigned at Downing Street protesting. A president cried quarantine. Moscow sent food and guns to Barcelona. A housewife of Duluth boycotted German goods. An emperor of Ethiopia said in good French before the statesmen of Geneva,
Je suis venu pour avertir l'Europe de la catastrophe qui l'attend.
I came to give Europe warning of the doom that awaits it.
Je suis venu pour défendre la cause de toutes les petites nations menacées d'agression.
I came defending the cause of all small people who were threatened with aggression.
Aujourd'hui, le problème a une portée beaucoup plus étendue que l'agression italienne en elle-même. C'est la sécurité collective.
The problem today is much wider than merely a question of Italian aggression. It is collective security.
La moralité internationale est en jeu.
It is international morality which is at stake.
Dieu et l'histoire se rappelleront de votre jugement.
God and history will remember your judgment.
signs and portents. It was no furtive tapping on the windowsill at night, but clamorous pounding in the public square, blow after blow like a monstrous drop forge, beating into shape the time to come. And the time came, and the prophecies matured. The storm arrived, and was no surprise to the barometer, the Jew who had cautioned.
The Nazis are not against the Jews alone. That's just a sham. If you let them carry on this way, there'll be the death of Christians, too.
He saw Gentiles die as well, and sighed, and foraged for bullets in the cellars of the Warsaw Ghetto. Yea, and the time came, and it developed that Cassandra and the Jew were right, and that the Cliveden set was wrong. Fire and brimstone dropping from the sky were educational. There were tongues and torpedoes, sermons in bombs, books in the running battles. Whatever was learned the hard way, between blood transfusions and last rites. Each lesson fell trip-hammer hard, with a bang that killed a citizen or two somewhere.
We've learned out of World War II that we'd learned nothing out of World War I.
We've learned that nations don't know what they want will get what they don't want.
We've learned that our east coast is the west bank of the Rhine, and the defenses of Portland begin in Shanghai.
Soft answer doesn't turn away wrath. And if you offer your other cheek to a fascist, you'll get your head blown off.
We've learned that a newspaper with a big circulation right at home can lie with a straight face 7 days a week and be as filthy and fascist as a handout in Berlin.
We've learned that those most concerned with saving the world from communism usually turn up making it safe for fascists.
We've learned that women can work and fight as well as look pretty and cook.
We've learned the Germans came close to winning the first time, even closer the second time, and might damn well win if we give them a third time.
We've learned the value of allies in a world where any war is sooner or later a world war.
We've learned that some men will fight for power, but that most men will fight to be free.
We've learned that freedom isn't something to be won and then forgotten. It must be renewed like soil after yielding good crops, must be rewound like a faithful clock, exercised like a healthy muscle. Free men who forget that lose their freedom.
and many more. These are the lessons our sons and brothers have turned to dust to teach us. And whether victory will stick and the dead be not made fools of depends on whether what we learn is held as close and constant as a catechism. Come summer and prosperity, come winter and the wolf, come ebb tide and come flood.
Amazing. It almost makes you, if you're a writer, afraid to ever try writing again. And the power of this man, we're going to hear a little excerpt of him at the end of this session too. Before turning to Richard, I should tell you that this radio drama that you just heard, which was first broadcast on May 8th, 1945, VE Day, was broadcast on CBS radio network, which was almost synonymous with Norman Corwin. CBS here is represented on the AM dial by KNX Radio, 1070. It became, of course, an all-news station, except for one day a year. May 8th, every year, they would rebroadcast on a note of triumph, and they did it until about 3 or 4 years ago. Amazing tribute to this one man.